Katherine Johnson clutched her calculation papers against her chest, running through the torrential downpour. Her worn leather shoes splashed through puddles, soaking her feet with each desperate step. The documents she protected so carefully were getting damp despite her efforts, ink beginning to smear from the relentless rain. 1.5 miles, just to use a restroom. When she burst through the office doors 40 minutes later, every eye in the room turned towards her. Harold Pierce shot up from his desk, his face flushed red with anger. "Where the hell have you been for 40 minutes?" he barked in front of the entire engineering team. Katherine stood there, dripping wet, her white blouse clinging to her back, her hair disheveled and flattened against her skull. She looked more like a scolded child than a 34-year-old mathematician. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Her voice trembled as she tried to explain. "Sorry doesn't cut it! This is NASA, not some country fair!" Pierce's voice echoed through the room. Snickers erupted from the corner where her white colleagues sat. Katherine felt her heart shatter into tiny pieces with each cruel laugh. She had no idea that the woman they were humiliating today would soon become the person they'd all desperately need to save their lives. At 34, Katherine Johnson, with her dark skin, her hair always neatly tied back, wore a neatly pressed white blouse and grey skirt to work every day. She treasured each outfit like armor, keeping them spotless, as if her perfect appearance could protect her from the cruelty of the world. Katherine remembered her first day at NASA like it was yesterday. Her mother, Joylette, had spent the entire morning pressing that single white blouse, smoothing each crease as if she were ironing hope itself into the fabric. "Baby girl, this is your chance," her mother had said, eyes shining with pride and dreams. "I know you're going to make us all proud." The words carried the weight of generations, the hopes of every ancestor who had been denied the opportunities now opening before Katherine. Growing up in West Virginia in the late 1920s, 10-year-old Katherine had sat in the tiny schoolhouse solving quadratic equations while her 8th-grade classmates struggled with basic multiplication. Her teacher, Mr. Matthews, had written a complex fraction problem on the blackboard, watching as the entire class squirmed in their seats. Katherine raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, I know a faster way to solve this." The teacher's response was swift and cold. "I didn't ask you." But Katherine couldn't help herself. She stood up and walked to the board, her small hands moving the chalk with confidence. Numbers danced in her head like musical notes, creating beautiful patterns that made perfect sense. 30 seconds later, she had written the correct answer. The class sat in stunned silence as Mr. Matthews checked her work. "It was perfect. How did you—" he stammered, staring at this extraordinary child who seemed to speak the language of mathematics as naturally as breathing. "I don't know, sir. The numbers just talk to me," Katherine had replied with the innocent honesty of youth. When Katherine turned 12, she entered the statewide mathematics competition. While other contestants needed 2 full hours to complete the exam, she finished in 20 minutes, then sat quietly waiting, her heart pounding with anticipation. But when the results were announced, her name wasn't on the list. The first prize went to Tommy, a white boy whose score was significantly lower than hers. "Why wasn't I chosen?" Katherine asked the judge, tears threatening to spill from her young eyes. The man looked down at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. "The prize is only for white students, child." That night, Katherine sobbed in her mother's arms while Joylette stroked her hair, her own tears falling silently. "Baby, sometimes this world isn't fair," her mother whispered, "but I believe that someday you're going to prove them all wrong." At 17, Katherine graduated from West Virginia University 2 years early, with degrees in mathematics and French. During the graduation ceremony, her family was the only black family in attendance. Her mother wore her finest dress and sat with the dignity of a queen, beaming with pride as Katherine walked across that stage. "I'm so proud of you," Joylette whispered when Katherine received her diploma, but finding work proved to be a nightmare. "We don't hire colored women as engineers," employers would say without even glancing at her impressive credentials. Katherine felt her dreams crumbling with each rejection. Then NASA opened its doors for human computers, women who would perform complex calculations by hand for aviation projects. Katherine saw this as her lifeline, her chance to grab hold of a future that seemed to be slipping away. When she was accepted into the colored computers section, her heart soared, despite the segregated conditions. Finally, she would get to work with numbers again, even if it meant sitting in a separate area designated specifically for black women. On her first day at NASA, Katherine wore that carefully pressed white blouse her mother had prepared, walking into the massive building with her heart racing from both excitement and terror. "You'll be working here," the supervisor said, pointing to a corner of the room far removed from everyone else. "This is the colored computers section." Katherine looked around at the other black women, all sitting with their heads down, calculating in silence. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one seemed to have any hope left. She sat down at her assigned wooden desk, picked up her pencil with trembling hands, and tried to convince herself that at least she was working with numbers again. They didn't discriminate based on skin color. Numbers only cared about right and wrong, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her big dreams had just been reduced to this small desk and a stack of papers. Still, it was a beginning, and Katherine had learned long ago that sometimes beginnings come disguised as endings. 3 months into her job at NASA, Katherine sat in her cold corner of the office, listening to the lively conversations floating over from the white engineers section. They were discussing Project Mercury, the mission to put humans into space. She could hear their animated debates about orbital mechanics, velocity calculations, and gravitational forces. Everything she had dreamed of studying, everything that made her heart race with excitement, was happening just 30 feet away from her. Yet she might as well have been on another planet. Katherine was assigned only the most basic calculations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, problems that reminded her of elementary school arithmetic. When Harold Pierce dropped another stack of simple computations on her desk, he didn't even bother to look at her. "The machine got these wrong somehow," he muttered. "Just clean up the mess." Katherine completed in 10 minutes what had taken the computer 2 hours. When she handed back the corrected work, Pierce snatched the papers and examined them with obvious skepticism. "How did you do this so fast?" he demanded. "I just looked at the numbers and saw the answer," Katherine replied honestly. "Cut the show-off act. You probably worked on these at home." Pierce snapped, walking away before she could defend herself. Katherine felt the familiar sting of humiliation wash over her. No matter what she did, it would never be enough to convince them she belonged here. Then came the devastating news that would change everything. Katherine was being temporarily transferred to the Flight Research Division, the sacred ground where white engineers calculated rocket trajectories. For the first time in NASA's history, a black woman would set foot in their hallowed halls. Katherine spent the entire night before her transfer, lying awake, wondering if she had the courage to walk into a room where she clearly wasn't wanted. Her first day in the new division felt like stepping into a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. Katherine entered the room wearing her meticulously pressed white blouse and her most confident expression, but inside she felt like a frightened child on the first day of school. The room fell completely silent. 15 white engineers stared at her as if she were an exotic animal that had somehow wandered into their territory. "You'll be sitting there," one of them said, pointing to a desk positioned in the farthest corner of the room. There was no computer, no technical manuals, no anything. Just blank paper and a pencil. The message was clear. You don't belong here, and we're going to make sure you know it. The first week was absolute torture. Conversations would stop the moment she approached. During meetings, they acted as if she were invisible, discussing complex calculations right in front of her, while deliberately excluding her from any meaningful participation. This information isn't appropriate for your level, Dave Miller would say whenever Katherine asked about rocket data, his voice dripping with condescension. She could see the calculations they were struggling with, could spot the errors they were making, but no one cared about her input. She was decoration, a token presence to check some bureaucratic box, but the worst part of each day was the bathroom situation. The colored women restroom was located in a different building, nearly 2 kilometers away. Every time nature called, Katherine had to make the long journey across the campus, losing almost 40 minutes of her day. The walk took her past multiple whites-only facilities that she couldn't use, a daily reminder of her second-class status. On rainy days, the trek became a nightmare. She would run through the downpour, clutching her work papers against her chest, trying to protect the calculations that represented her only value to the organization. One particularly stormy afternoon, Katherine returned from her bathroom odyssey looking like a drowned rat. Her white blouse was soaked through, her hair was plastered to her head, and her papers were damp despite her best efforts to shield them. As she entered the office, every conversation stopped. Pierce stood up slowly, his face turning red with anger. 40 minutes to go to the bathroom? He shouted, his voice carrying across the entire floor. What do you think this is, a vacation resort? The room erupted in snickers and whispered comments. Why did they even hire these people? Someone muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. They're just slowing down the program. Katherine stood there dripping wet, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She wanted to explain about the distance, about the segregated facilities, about the daily humiliation of being treated like a second-class citizen. Instead, she just whispered, "I'm sorry," and hurried to her desk. That night, Katherine sat on her kitchen floor and cried until she had no tears left. Her mother, Joylette, found her there and wrapped her in a warm embrace. "I want to quit, Mama." Katherine sobbed. "I can't take this anymore. They hate me there. They think I'm worthless." Joylette held her daughter tighter, her own heart breaking at the pain in Katherine's voice. "Baby girl," she said softly. "Sometimes we have to walk through the darkness to find the light. You weren't born to fit into their world. You were born to change it." Her mother's words felt like a small flame flickering in Katherine's chest. She wiped her tears and made a decision to return the next day, not knowing that the biggest storm of her life was still approaching. But she also didn't know that sometimes the strongest trees are the ones that learn to bend in the fiercest winds, and that her moment to stand tall was coming sooner than she could imagine. Al Harrison first noticed Katherine on a late Tuesday evening when he was making his rounds through the office. Most employees had gone home hours ago, but there she was in her corner, bent over her calculations like a scholar studying ancient texts. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over papers covered in neat, precise handwriting. Every number looked like a small work of art, carefully crafted and perfectly aligned. "You're still here?" Harrison asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Katherine jumped, startled by his presence. She quickly stood up, smoothing down her rumpled white blouse. "Yes, sir, I was just double-checking some calculations," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison walked closer to her desk, examining the papers scattered across its surface. What he saw made him pause. These weren't the simple arithmetic problems she was supposed to be working on. These were complex orbital mechanics equations, the kind that gave his senior engineers headaches. "You do this every night?" he asked, genuinely curious. Katherine nodded nervously. "I want to make sure everything is correct, sir. I know how important accuracy is for the safety of our pilots." Harrison picked up one of her worksheets, studying the elegant mathematics that flowed across the page like poetry. "Where did you learn to do calculations like this?" Katherine hesitated, unsure whether honesty would get her in trouble. "I studied advanced mathematics in college, sir, but they told me these problems were too challenging for my position." Harrison set the paper down slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Conference room B. Be there." Katherine barely slept that night. She stood in front of her small mirror, practicing what she might say, wondering if this was her chance, or if she was walking into another humiliation. When 9 o'clock arrived, she stood outside the conference room door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Inside, Harrison was addressing the entire engineering team. "Gentlemen, starting today, Katherine Johnson will be joining our orbital calculations group." The room erupted in protests and uncomfortable murmurs. Pierce immediately stood up, his face flushed with indignation. "With all due respect, sir, she's just a low-level computer. She doesn't have the background for this kind of work." "What kind of work is that, Pierce?" Harrison asked calmly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Pierce struggled for words, realizing he was about to say something that would reveal his true feelings. "Well, she's not qualified for advanced calculations." Harrison smiled slightly. "Really? Because last night I watched her solve orbital mechanics problems that have been giving your team trouble for weeks." He gestured for Katherine to approach the blackboard. "Show them," he said simply. Katherine walked to the front of the room on shaking legs, feeling every eye boring into her. She picked up the chalk with trembling fingers, and for a moment her mind went completely blank. Then she looked at the complex equation written on the board, one that the team had been wrestling with for 2 weeks, and the numbers began to speak to her again. For the next 15 minutes, Katherine lost herself in the mathematics, her hand moving confidently across the blackboard as she broke down the problem into elegant, understandable steps. When she finished, she turned around to face a room full of stunned silence. Dave Miller was the first to speak, his voice barely audible. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "She's right." Another engineer pulled out his slide rule to double-check her work. "Every step is perfect," he confirmed, disbelief evident in his voice. Katherine stood there, still holding the chalk, hardly believing what had just happened. For the first time in her life, a room full of white engineers was looking at her, with something that resembled respect. But the real test came a week later, when Pierce cornered Katherine about her frequent absences. The man had been watching her like a hawk, timing her bathroom breaks and making snide comments about her dedication. On this particular day, he decided to make his move in front of the entire team. "I need to address Miss Johnson's habit of disappearing for 40 minutes at a time," he announced loudly. "This is supposed to be a professional workplace, not a social club." Katherine felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks, but something inside her snapped. Maybe it was the week of working on real problems, or maybe it was just years of accumulated frustration finally boiling over. "You want to know where I go?" Katherine stood up, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "I run 1.5 miles to the colored women's restroom because that's the closest one I'm allowed to use. 1.5 miles there, 1.5 miles back. In the rain, in the snow, in the blazing heat. Do you want me to fly instead?" The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Katherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not disappearing to socialize or take breaks. I'm running across this entire facility just to use a bathroom because someone decided that the color of my skin determines which toilet I'm worthy of." Pierce's face went white, then red, then white again. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The other engineers stared at their hands, suddenly very interested in their paperwork. Harrison, who had been listening from the doorway, turned around and walked out without saying a word. Katherine sat back down, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She had just spoken truth to power in a way that no black woman had ever done at NASA. She didn't know if she had just saved her career or destroyed it. The next morning, Katherine arrived at work to find Harrison standing outside the colored women's restroom with a hammer in his hand. Without ceremony, he began smashing the sign that had divided the facility for years. Bang, bang, bang! The metal sign fell to the floor with a satisfying crash. "From now on," he announced to the gathering crowd, "at NASA we all pee the same color." Katherine stood in the distance, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in 34 years, someone had stood up for her. Someone had decided that her dignity mattered. It was a small step, but sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single, courageous step in the right direction. After the barriers fell, Katherine didn't celebrate. She knew that tearing down signs was easier than changing hearts, and she understood that her real test was just beginning. The opportunity to prove herself worthy had arrived, and she refused to waste it on anything less than absolute excellence. In December of 1961, Project Mercury was preparing to launch John Glenn into orbit, making him the first American to circle the Earth. The entire nation would be watching, and the smallest miscalculation could kill Glenn and bury America's space program forever. The new IBM computer system had processed all the orbital calculations, producing hundreds of pages of trajectory data that would guide Glenn's historic flight. But Glenn himself had an unusual request that sent shockwaves through NASA's hierarchy. "I want the girl Katherine to check the numbers," he told the mission directors. "I trust computers, but I trust her more." Pierce was incredulous. "You're willing to bet your life on her calculations over $1 million computer?" Glenn's response was simple and unwavering. "I'm betting my life on whoever gives me the most accurate numbers, and from what I've seen, that's Katherine Johnson." The comment stung Pierce's ego, but Glenn's reputation as America's finest pilot made his request impossible to ignore. Katherine was handed 300 pages of complex orbital mechanics calculations and given 48 hours to verify every single number. Katherine set up camp in her office that night, surrounding herself with coffee cups and calculation sheets, like a general preparing for battle. She worked through the night without stopping, fueled by caffeine and the overwhelming responsibility of a human life depending on her accuracy. Her white blouse became wrinkled from hunching over her desk, her hair escaped from its neat bun, and dark circles formed under her eyes. When Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson arrived at 6 a.m. with sandwiches, they found Katherine exactly where they'd left her 12 hours earlier. "You need to eat something," Dorothy said gently, setting food in front of her exhausted friend. "Honey, you can't save Glenn if you collapse from hunger." "I can't eat right now," Katherine replied, without looking up from her calculations. "What if I made a mistake? What if I missed something? Glenn is counting on me to keep him alive." Mary sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on Katherine's shoulder. "You're the smartest person any of us know. If anyone can get this right, it's you." But Katherine was tormented by self-doubt. "What if everyone is wrong about me? What if I'm not as good as you all think I am?" Dorothy's voice was firm and reassuring. "Katherine Johnson, you were born to do this work. Trust yourself the way Glenn trusts you." At 2 a.m, during her second sleepless night, Katherine discovered the error that would have killed John Glenn. The IBM computer had miscalculated atmospheric drag at an altitude of 120 kilometers, creating a trajectory that would send Glenn's capsule careening into the Atlantic Ocean instead of landing safely off the coast of Florida. The error was tiny, just 0.02 of a degree, but in the unforgiving mathematics of spaceflight, tiny errors meant death. Catherine's hands shook as she double-checked and triple-checked her calculations. When she was absolutely certain, she picked up the phone and called Harrison at 3 in the morning. "Sir, we have a serious problem with Glenn's landing trajectory," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "The computer calculations are wrong. If we use those numbers, Glenn will never make it home." Harrison arrived at the office within an hour, finding Katherine surrounded by pages of handwritten calculations that looked like the work of a master mathematician. She walked him through every step of her analysis, her voice growing stronger as she explained how the computer had failed to account for atmospheric density variations. "If we don't correct this," she concluded, "Glenn will splash down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no rescue ships anywhere near him." The next morning brought an emergency meeting that would determine the fate of America's space program. 20 of NASA's top engineers crowded into the conference room, watching as Katherine, a 34-year-old black woman who had been washing dishes at a diner just years earlier, stood before them explaining why their multi-million-dollar computer was wrong. Her presentation was masterful, breaking down complex physics into clear, logical steps that even non-experts could follow. When she finished, the room sat in stunned silence. Dave Miller, the man who had once questioned why NASA hired these people, was the first to speak. "I've checked her work 3 times, he said quietly. "Katherine is absolutely right. If we had used the computer's trajectory, we would have lost Glenn." One by one, the other engineers confirmed her calculations. The woman they had dismissed as unqualified had just saved the life of America's greatest hero and preserved the nation's space program. Pierce sat in his chair, his face pale, realizing that his prejudices had nearly led to catastrophe. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn blasted off from Cape Canaveral, following the trajectory that Katherine had calculated by hand. For 4 hours and 55 minutes, he orbited the Earth, while millions of Americans held their breath. Katherine sat in mission control, watching the telemetry data and praying that her mathematics would bring him home safely. When Glenn's voice crackled over the radio saying, "I am landed safely," Katherine collapsed into her chair and wept. But these weren't tears of exhaustion or relief. These were tears of vindication, of a lifetime of being underestimated finally giving way to undeniable proof of her worth. The success of Glenn's mission transformed Katherine's status at NASA overnight. Colleagues who had ignored her began seeking her input on their calculations. Engineers who had dismissed her started asking for her opinion on complex problems. The woman who had been forced to run through rainstorms just to use a bathroom was now being consulted on the most critical calculations in America's space program. When reporters asked Glenn about the mission's success, he gave full credit to the team, but always made sure to mention the brilliant mathematician Katherine Johnson, who made sure I could find my way home. But Katherine's greatest satisfaction didn't come from the praise or recognition. It came from the young black girls who started showing up at NASA, asking if they could meet the woman who had helped send John Glenn into space. When a 10-year-old named Sarah approached her in the hallway and said, "Miss Katherine, I want to be a mathematician just like you." Katherine knelt down to the child's level and smiled. "Baby girl, you can be anything you want to be," she said. "The numbers don't care what color you are. They only care if you're right." As she watched that little girl walk away with newfound confidence, Katherine realized that her most important calculation had nothing to do with rockets or orbits. It was the formula for showing an entire generation of children that their dreams had no limits, that brilliance came in all colors, and that sometimes the most important barriers to break were the ones inside people's hearts and minds. 1 week after Glenn's triumphant return, Katherine walked into the NASA cafeteria as she did every day. But something was different. Instead of the usual pointed stares and whispered conversations, she noticed people looking at her with what appeared to be genuine respect. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel like an intruder in her own workplace. "Katherine!" called a young engineer from across the room. Would you like to join us for lunch? The invitation was simple, but it represented a seismic shift in the social dynamics of NASA. Katherine approached the table hesitantly, still not entirely convinced this wasn't some elaborate joke at her expense. As she sat down, Dave Miller, the same man who had once questioned her very presence, placed a cup of coffee in front of her. "Katherine," he said, his eyes focused on his hands rather than her face, "I owe you an apology. I said some things. I was wrong, completely wrong." Katherine could see the genuine remorse in his expression, the weight of his prejudice finally confronting him. "Dave, we all make mistakes," she replied gently. "What matters is what we learn from them and how we choose to move forward." That afternoon, Harrison called Katherine into his private office, gesturing for her to take the chair directly across from his desk, not the corner position she had occupied for so long. "Katherine, I have some news that I think you'll appreciate," he began, with a rare smile. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to senior mathematician with a 40% salary increase. More importantly, your name will appear on all scientific reports and publications. No more working in the shadows." Katherine sat motionless, struggling to process what she was hearing. After years of anonymous contributions, her work would finally carry her signature. "There's something else," Harrison continued. "The Colored Computers Division is being disbanded. From now on, all our mathematicians work together as one team, regardless of background." The changes rippled through NASA like stones thrown into still water. The segregated bathrooms became a relic of the past. The separate coffee pots disappeared. The invisible barriers that had divided the workplace began crumbling one by one. But the most meaningful transformation for Katherine occurred the following week, when she encountered a group of young black women standing nervously outside her office. "Excuse me," one of them said shyly. "Are you Katherine Johnson?" When Katherine confirmed her identity, the young woman's face lit up with excitement. "We're the new intern class. We came to NASA because of you. We want to become mathematicians just like you." Katherine looked at these bright young faces and saw her own dreams reflected back at her. She remembered being their age, wondering if someone who looked like her could ever succeed in a field dominated by others. "What makes you think you can do this work?" she asked, not out of doubt but out of curiosity. "Because you proved it was possible," another intern replied. "You showed us that talent doesn't have a color, and that's all we needed to know." Katherine felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had broken through barriers not just for herself, but for an entire generation of young women who would never have to wonder if they belonged in the world of science and mathematics. As the years passed, Katherine continued her work with quiet dignity and relentless precision. In 1969, she watched from mission control as Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the moon. The calculations she had performed 7 years earlier had helped guide that historic mission, but her name wasn't mentioned in the television coverage. She didn't mind. Katherine had learned that the most important victories often happen without fanfare or recognition. The real triumph was knowing that her work had helped humanity reach for the stars, but recognition would eventually come. In 2015, 53 years after Glenn's historic flight, President Obama awarded Katherine Johnson the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. "This remarkable woman," he said, "helped our nation reach new heights and showed us that the barriers we place on ourselves are often the only ones that truly matter." As Katherine, now 97 years old, stood on that stage, she wasn't thinking about the honor or the applause. She was thinking about the little girls in the audience, the young faces looking up at her with the same wonder she had once felt when contemplating the mysteries of mathematics. After the ceremony, an 8-year-old named Maya approached Katherine with a hand-drawn picture of a rocket ship. "Mrs. Katherine," the child said, "I want to be a scientist like you when I grow up." Katherine knelt down to Maya's level, just as she had done with countless other young dreamers over the years. "Baby girl, you can be anything you want to be," she said, her voice full of warmth and conviction. "The most important thing is to never let anyone else define what you're capable of. Your dreams are valid, no matter what anyone else might say." That evening, Katherine stood at her window, looking up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, the International Space Station was orbiting Earth, following trajectories that her calculations had helped establish. But her greatest achievement wasn't sending humans into space. It was proving that excellence knows no boundaries, that brilliance can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with a single person refusing to accept the limitations that others try to impose. Katherine thought about all the young people who had told her they were pursuing careers in science because her story had inspired them. She thought about the barriers that had fallen not just at NASA, but throughout American society, as people began to recognize that talent and intelligence were gifts that belonged to all of humanity. Most importantly, she thought about her mother, Joylette, whose unwavering faith had carried her through the darkest moments of doubt and discrimination. As she prepared for bed that night, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her from a segregated schoolhouse in West Virginia to the pinnacle of American scientific achievement. The path had been difficult, marked by humiliation, loneliness, and countless obstacles that had seemed impossible to overcome. But every challenge had strengthened her resolve, every setback had deepened her determination, and every victory had opened doors for those who would follow in her footsteps. The woman who had once run through rainstorms just to use a bathroom had helped humanity reach for the moon, and in doing so, she had proven that no dream is too big, no barrier too high, and no person too small to change the world. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of refusing to let others determine your worth, and Katherine Johnson's legacy would continue inspiring generations long after the last star had faded from the sky.